is our new events coordinator and has been a lifeline in helping me set up these winter talks. I couldn't have done it without her, so thank you, Tiffany. So I'm very pleased to introduce you to our speaker this evening, Patricia Ferguson. Patricia is a ceramic researcher, a former curatorial consultant at the Victorian Albert Museum and the British Museum. She is an advisor on ceramics for the National Trust and other heritage organisations. Her publications include Pots, Prints and Politics, Ceramics with an Agenda from the 14th to the 20th Century, Ceramics, 400 Years of British Collecting in 100 Masterpieces, and Garnitures, Vase Sets from the National Trust Houses. This evening, Patricia's talk will be exploring the Rococo through Chelsea's gold anchor vases. Thank you very much, Patricia.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak. And also, I know a lot of planning goes on behind it, so I appreciate that a great deal, all the work that goes in, and I think these talks are going to be very successful. So, Chelsea gold anchor vases, at their most extreme, high Rococo style, are contentious and problematic. Some people, even in this audience, will argue that aesthetically, it was their least successful product. As Timothy Clifford has noted, the Rococo style was too playful, too outrageous, and too exuberant for British Protestant patrons. Yet, when new, some of the Chelsea's interpretations found a ready market in the fashionable homes of its aristocracy. In terms of design, the modeling, painting, and gilding, though they may leave much to be desired, technically, they represent the best of 18th century British porcelain production. The trophy of aristocratic households when new, their forms were recreated in the early 19th century during the Rococo revival. From the 1862 International Exhibition held in London until the 1920s, there was a resurgence of popularity among collectors, evidenced by their record auction prices. The Chelsea factory was founded in London around 1745, just 6 years before the Worcester factory in 1751. While Worcester dabbled in Rococo forms, particularly in their early boats, the Chelsea factory became synonymous with this continental style. Initially focusing on Meissen porcelain interpretations before casting their eyes to France. But consequentially, it started on the eve of the 7 Years' War, which began in 1756 and ended in February 1763, and it had an enormous impact on design dissemination into Britain. This talk is a chance to explore the Rococo through these vases made at the Chelsea factory during the so-called gold anchor period. And of course, discussion is indebted to the research of J.V.J. Mallet, or John Mallet as we know him, who published a wonderful article in the English Ceramic Circle in 1999 on which this talk is grounded. And as well, I have the many articles by Errol Manners in the same journal that I have used to draw some conclusions. Sorry, it's just going a little slow or not going at all. Okay, there we go. English soft paste porcelain, commercially viable from the mid-1740s, came late to the Rococo, a style which emanated from the Baroque in the early 1730s through a French goldsmith, Juste Aurel Misonnier, who was born in Turin, in Italy. His designs, disseminated through engravings, were quickly adopted by English silversmiths and English cabinet makers. And very simply, this Rococo style is characterized by asymmetry, with curving scrollwork in the shape of the letter C, as well as Hogarth's serpentine S-shaped lines, while incorporating shells, coral, rockwork, and other motifs from nature. These elements were synthesized to create bizarre and picturesque effects with a delicate, whimsical spirit. Here, exquisitely captured in the center in the elegant, fine-drawn lines of a skilled, academically trained draftsman, and reproduced in embossed, chased, and engraved silver on the left, or in carved wood on the right. At the time, known in France as the genre pittoresque, and in England as the modern taste. The term Rococo was only introduced around 1800 to describe anything old-fashioned as a form of ridicule. It only became an accepted term to describe the style in the mid-20th century. Porcelain, with its infinite plasticity, was an ideal material for the Rococo idiom. Chelsea made a few forays as early as 1747, as the Liège-born proprietor Nicholas Fremont, himself a trained goldsmith, had personal connections with the development of this new continental style. However, for the majority of British porcelain manufacturers, understandably cautious and conservative, the style was slow to be incorporated, commencing in earnest only around 1755. Even then, its elegance in the hands of local and foreign-born craftsmen took on a pragmatic robustness, which characterizes the English Rococo style. Increasingly, from the 1760s, design favored a symmetrical neoclassical core with superficial references to the Rococos in the form of handles or painted decoration. These ornaments gradually decreased throughout the 1770s before all but disappearing until its brief revival in the early 19th century. Scholars have divided the Chelsea factory into 4 chronological periods, primarily based on changes in the factory marks. And for the sake of time, I'm really just focusing on the final of these, which is the gold anchor period. And there's several books that you could read or go online if you want to know more about the first 3 periods. So it's commonly dated, thanks to Mallet's work, as beginning of 1758 to 1768, so a decade. The starting date was late 1758, when Fremont was preparing to launch his factory with an auction of new stock in March 1759. The sales accompanying advertisement mentions new vase shapes with the following ground colors: blue and gold and pea green and gold. The end date is suggested as February 1768, when Fremont announced he leaves off making because of his health, a reference to an illness that had frequently disrupted production. In the absence of any dated objects, the chronology and the dating of these vases is much debated, particularly concerning when production actually ceased, as there is little evidence of activity after early 1764. At this date, Fremont had advertised several sales of his factory building, his molds, and models, a sale which fortunately did not take place. However, from 1764 until 1769, staffage was minimal until the factory was finally sold in 1769 and again in 1770 to a new buyer. At that time, it was the potter William Dewsbury of Derby. Mallet has made a convincing argument that production, certainly of any new forms, had ended in 1764. Significantly, in the spring of 1765, the French historian Pierre-Jean Groslay arrived in London to record his observations on British culture, arts, and industries. In a short entry in a subsequent publication, under earthenware, he states, "That of Chelsea, the most important of them all, had just collapsed when I arrived in London." And he actually used the term Chelsea had fallen in his in the English translation of his work. So, if we believe him, there really was no production, certainly by the spring of 1765. Oops. How did that happen? Oh, wait here. Sorry. Sorry about that. Yes. Fortunately, there are several key documents or objects available to offer guidance. The first is this painting depicting a corpulent Fremont seated in the center. Behind him, his wife Anne, and the woman just entering from the left is his sister-in-law, Susanna Proton. Both women were involved in the factory. Surrounding them are 6 recognizable Chelsea gold anchor period. Sorry, there's just going to click something here. Okay. Okay, sorry. Surrounding them are 6 recognizable Chelsea gold anchor period vases in various stages of production: undecorated, painted with underglazed blue or overglazed green, enamel painted, and finally gilded. The carefully staged group was presumably commissioned by the seemingly healthy Sprimont from an as yet unidentified painter. Perhaps it was to display in his shop. Significantly, no figures or tablewares are depicted, nor the claret or crimson ground color first mentioned in April 1760, again providing an end date for the painting. The emphasis was on his vases in a new style employing both colors, the Mazarine blue and the pea green, a close match to his March 1759 newspaper announcement, and hence a suggestion for the date. The painting was acquired by the Victoria and Albert Museum in 2021 and now hangs in the British galleries. The most interesting of the vases is the white, undecorated perfume pot at Spremont's elbow. It's a direct copy of a French porcelain shape made at Vincennes before the French royal factory moved to Sèvres on the other side of Paris in around 1756. The shape is known as a potpourri au jour and was designed by the French goldsmith, sculptor, and designer Jean-Claude Duplessis-Père. It was introduced at Vincennes around 1752, and the one seen here on the extreme left, now in the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris, was identified by Errol Manners as that purchased in Paris by an English aristocrat, Frederick St. John, 2nd Viscount Bolingbroke, who may have lent it to Spremont to copy around 1758 or 59. Next to it is a Chelsea copy, circa 1758 to 60, in the Mint Museum. Now, John Mallet has suggested that the Vincennes prototype, the only model from the French Royal Factory copied during the gold anchor period, was the inspiration for a highly inventive group of Chelsea potpourri vases. Each seen here are raised on 4 scrolled supports with ornate pierced necks and covers, but with the addition of Spremont scroll handles. By 1759, and indeed from May 1756, the start of the 7 Years' War placed restrictions on trade with France and Germany, which meant Spremont had lost access to a steady stream of new models from the continent to copy. And I'm just showing you an example of the same shapes, but in a crimson or claret colored ground at the National Trust. They're quite a famous set of 7 vases, which I've talked about elsewhere, but I won't go into them here. Another shape in the painting, almost hidden on the floor in front of the table, is a blue ground vase and cover with the elaborate foliate scroll handles, similar to this porcelain vase at the Huntington in California. The new color was also based on a French prototype, Vincennes Bleu Lapis, introduced 5 years earlier in 1751. Chelsea frequently lagged about 5 years behind continental design innovations, so Spremont would have had several years of grace before his stock might have begun to look quite dated. The handles closely resemble the French gilt metal or ormolu mounts on this Chinese blue ground porcelain vase. Many of these vases were also decorated with gold-painted designs. Yet another critical document is the existence of a partial copy of the 1761 Chelsea auction sale catalogue, although it is just the first 4 days of the sale. It's available for study online at the website of the John D. Rockefeller Jr. Library at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, and I would encourage you to have a look at it there. As an unusual business model, Chelsea held annual auctions of their stock, of which the 1755 and the 1756 auctions all survive. Copies of these are also available online at the Rockefeller Library. Significantly, there were no auctions between 1764 and 1769. The selection of objects seen here represents the variety of vases described in the partial 1761 catalog, and includes a few that were actually also in the painting of 1759. The claret ground was now available, as you can see, and many of these subjects decorating the objects are either painted after old masters, copied from print sources, groups of Chinese figures, as well as scenes after Watteau and Teniers. Both were named in the text. Among the few securely datable vases is the pair in the British Museum, seen in the center. They were given anonymously on 15th of April, 1763, delivered by Mr. Empson, and described as the product of 1762. The other is the foundling vase on the extreme right, a valuable gift in 1763 to the Foundling Hospital for Abandoned Children in Bloomsbury by the apothecary Dr. George Garnier on 20th of April, again, 1763. Garnier was a member of the Society of Dilettanti and a connoisseur of modern art, acquiring 7 canalettos in the 1740s. It's frequently assumed that Dr. Garnier was also the donor to the British Museum. He evidently appreciated the products of this manufactory and wished to see examples for the public's enjoyment in these institutions, although he may also have been helping Spremont financially by promoting his wares. The pair to the foundling vase was acquired at a Chelsea auction in February 1770 by the Earl of Chesterfield, but was presumably made as well in 1762 or maybe 1763. The pair of Met vases on the left must also share a similar date. They too were sold in 1770. This 1770 sale, published in Nightingale in 1881 in his Contributions towards the History of Early English Porcelain, is all helpful to identify stock. It was advertised as being sold by order of Nicholas Spremont, but in fact, having sold his factory building, it included his finished or decorated stock recently purchased by a consortium, including the China dealer Thomas Morgan and 2 others. It may seem surprising to us that these icons of Chelsea gold anchor porcelain were still in stock almost 8 years after they were made. The Met vases and the Chesterfield vases may have been showpieces of the highest quality displayed in his warehouse or showrooms and unsold until 1770. To this group might be added a pair of vases at Huntington. One is illustrated on the lower right, decorated with La Bascule, or the seesaw, after Boucher, and the other has Le Colin Maillard, which is Blind Man's Bluff, after Fragonard. Both were after prints engraved in 1760, in the middle of the 7 Years' War, which matched the scenes of the vases at the British Museum, so the same print source was evidently used. Another pair of Chelsea vases, missing their covers at the Worcester Art Museum in Massachusetts, share the same subject as the Met examples. The shape, as we have seen, appeared in the 1761 catalogue. Each copies a print of L'Agréable Leçon after Boucher, published in Paris in 1758, but are perhaps the work of different painters. The Worcester Museum example is more hurriedly executed. Compare, for example, the treatment of the lion above the fountain. Secondly, the blue ground on the Worcester vase can be seen to be flowing into the design, a flaw solved with the raised border framing the Met Reserve panel on the left. Was that feature a later improvement, or did it only appear on costly show vases? An example of which we'll see this being used later. Finally, the gilding on the Worcester Museum vases is in the asymmetrical style incorporating rocaille, trellis work, and flowers typically found on Vassin porcelain, whereas the gilding on the Met vase surrounding the raised outline is symmetrical, as is the reserve itself in quite a different taste. Not sure what that meant, but anyway. Again, in trying to assess what porcelain was made by Chelsea, if any, in the late 1760s, it's telling that the porcelain depicted on the chimneypiece in this painting executed around 1768 by Johann Zoffany includes vases made at William Dewsbury's factory in provincial Derby rather than Spremont's latest production. As already noted, no new designs of anything at all were apparently produced at Chelsea from February 1768, and possibly since 1764. The painting depicts the celebrated actress, Mrs. Frances or Fanny Abington, in her role as the widow Belmore in Arthur Murray's play, The Way to Keep Him. Ceramics historians are able to confirm the painting's date based on the vases. The pair of Derby frill vases, circa 1764 to 68, and note that the birds do appear on the cover, but they're just barely visible. While the central single covered vase up above would have been brand new in 1768, just 2 years before Dewsbury acquired the Chelsea works. It's also interesting that the selection of vases in the painting did not depict a three-piece matching garniture. Examples of each, seen here, could have been selected, or perhaps the singleton was so new only one example was available. Alternatively, it could have been a garniture of Worcester frill vases, a set of Worcester frill vases, such as this example from the Ashmolean collection. Or if the actress's taste was for the more flamboyant, perhaps Chelsea's own version of frill vases. The type may match a frequent lot description in the 1761 catalogue for 1 honeycomb jar and 2 beakers, pea green ornament enameled with birds, which closely matches the single example on the lower right. Admittedly, the three-piece set could be from the Dewsbury period, made from Spremont's mold or his old undecorated stock. It was sold in Paris, and of course, I've not handled it. The Chelsea shape was also copied at Bow, as you know, and well, anyway, I won't say much about the taste of the shape. These three-piece Chelsea garnitures, the only three-piece sets advertised as such in the 1761 sale, may represent a direction Spremont was heading into before he launched his new look in March 1759. Ugh. Sorry. Yeah, okay. However, as a note of caution, the term honeycomb, which suggests a pierced network of cells, was presumably also used by the cataloger to describe the covered bowl and stand decorated with mayflowers or snowball flowers after a Meissen prototype frequently listed in the same 1761 catalogue. Instead, what is depicted in the painting is an assembled garniture, which presumably represents a personal choice or taste. Here, the commercially successful actress appears in her most famous role, not as an aristocrat, but perhaps the wife of an officer, who is depicted in a portrait on her bracelet. She performed the role between 1765 and 1770, selecting it for her benefit performance on 6th of April, 1768. The painting is said to have been commissioned by her shortly afterwards and was neither exhibited nor circulated as an engraving for her self-promotion and profit. Significantly, Mrs. Abington was described as an influencer, well, not using that word, but you know, and she was often consulted in the choice of fashionable ornaments for her female friends in high life. As part of her agency and self-fashioning, indeed, the three vases may have been her own or more nuanced. The Derby may have been more appropriate to the role, a widow of the officer class, reflecting her social position. While no Chelsea appears in other Zoffany paintings, several garnitures of unidentified manufacture, along with Chelsea figures of the seasons, were included in an auction of the contents of Zoffany's London townhouse, held by Christie and Ansell in 1772. Of course, it's worth noting that these ornate Chelsea vases may not have been intended for the chimney, but for a new furniture form such as the china case, as seen in this design by Chippendale in 1755. You may be wondering what the Chelsea Of course, you may be wondering what the Chelsea factory was producing before 1759, particularly in terms of the Rococo style and vases. This three-piece Chelsea garniture, circa 1755 to 58, after Chinese shapes, painted with Meissen-style naturalistic flower sprays, is at Sourhead in Wiltshire. It was purchased in 1759 by Henry Hoare, a member of the famous banking dynasty, through a London agent, Joseph Cartoni, a well-known China retailer. Interestingly, Hoare, at the time a wealthy widower, did not choose a garniture in the newest high Rococo style, but within a decade, he purchased examples of Wedgwood's fashionable black basalt wares. There was a clear change in design at Chelsea from about 1755 to 1756, and some of this new direction was based on a new porcelain paste just introduced. The paste now contained calcinated bone ash, which gave the porcelain greater resilience in the kiln, and it also contained significantly increased quantities of alumina, which improved its plasticity. This allowed the production to sustain more slender and elegant shapes without great distortion in the kiln. The Meissen factory, based in Saxony in Germany, had been Spremont's greatest competitor, or at least he saw it as such, but also a continuous source of inspiration. Although it was illegal to import wares such as Meissen from the continent for resale, the law was frequently ignored, and Meissen was frequently smuggled into England. Typical is this Meissen potpourri. Sorry, where am I? I've missed something here. Okay, typical is this Meissen potpourri on stand, on the left, modeled with a hound and partridges, or quails perhaps. The gilt bronze base was added in Paris when new and may suggest that Saxony's best items were for the French market. However, an identical model is in an English collection at Burghley House in Lincolnshire, though not identifiable in the 1763 inventory. On the right is a Chelsea potpourri vase with a similar hound identified in the 1755 and 1756 Chelsea auction sale catalogues of new stock as a setting dog, with hares replacing the birds. Chelsea's version is masterful, the foliate scrollwork revealing the silversmith's knowledge of chasing and proportion. Spremont's version did not need to rely on abundance of applied flowers, as charming as they are, to disguise a weak design. Another example of the Chelsea factory, trumping Meissen's Rococo, is this pair of potpourri in the British Museum. They are attributed to the Chelsea sculptor and modeler Joseph Willems, a veritable porcelain essay in the Rococo, incorporating all the vocabulary of the style: asymmetry, distortion, and theatricality. These perfume pots with Meleager and Atalanta were offered for sale in the 1755 auction. Clearly, they were inspired by the work of Meissen's greatest sculptor, Johann Joachim Kendler, but there is no German or continental prototype. The design showcases the white porcelain, which is not hidden with gratuitous colorful enamels as seen in the gold anchor wares. Chelsea's modelists could also get it wrong when imitating Meissen. These two ornamental urns on the left from a set emblematic of the Four Seasons may match descriptions in the 1756 auction catalog sale and the 16th and last day's sale, lot 3 to 56, a most beautiful urn representing autumn and summer, which richly chased in gilt and enameled with cupids. The Chelsea pair in the Metropolitan Museum on the right clearly imitate Meissen models of about 1750. Meissen models on the right of 1750 to 55. And while the Chelsea model was perhaps in production in 1756, these English copies, again, may be unfinished stock or made from old molds and decorated at Dewsbury's Chelsea studio sometime before 1770, but before 1784, when the London workshop was closed. As noted already, many of Chelsea's gold anchor vases were basically classical shapes with symmetrically applied Rococo scroll handles. In his 1999 article, John Mallett identified almost 50 different vases, including covered jars and pierced potpourri, of which just 13 are illustrated here and in no particular order. Each of these shapes appears to have had its own unique set of handles, requiring a complex set of bespoke plaster molds, a costly, if not crippling, investment for the factory. They also needed storage and maintenance, though I doubt any wore out from use. John Mallett describes decor applied to Chippendale forms. The quote references the design tension between the surface decoration and the ponderous shapes with their elaborate, eccentric, symmetrical handles. In essence, we have a French veneer with applied ormolu mounts on a Palladian carcass, the firm's house style repeated over and over with subtle variations. By contrast, the efficient and profitable Worcester porcelain factory around the same period, 1768 to 70, perhaps having learnt from Chelsea's excesses, only had one mold for a Rococo-style handle seen on the right, a sort of one-size-fits-all, but not exactly aesthetically successful. Instead, this provincial factory focused on a single hexagonal model after a Japanese shape, the so-called Hampton Court jar seen on the left, which they painted in a variety of fashionable designs, both Rococo and neoclassical. Of course, Worcester could produce wares in the Rococo style in the late 1760s, such as this bow pot for cut flowers, which is in contrast to the more restrained conservatism of its usual wares. Well, the concept of these porcelain mounts is clearly borrowed from French gilt bronze mounts. No identical prototypes are known. As a slight tangent, in 1768, Thomas Bentley, writing to Josiah Wedgwood, refers to the Parisian trade in recycled porcelain as recounted by Matthew Bolton. The artists have even come over to London, picked all the old, whimsical, ugly things they could meet with and carried them to Paris, where they have mounted and ornamented them with metal and sold them to the virtuosi of every nation, particularly to milordis d'Anglaise. It would be useful to identify examples owned by English connoisseurs in the 1750s as possible prototypes. However, before his arrival in London in 1742, Sprimont had been in Geneva and in Paris, where he possibly worked with the preeminent silversmith Thomas Germain. Tessa Murdoch has identified that Sprimont was in Paris in 1736 when he was arrested for whistling during an opera, which offers a small glimpse into his character. He no doubt brought a wealth of design ideas with him on his journey from Liège to London. His family were goldsmiths and jewelers who may have continued to correspond with him concerning the latest fashions, especially as the wealthy Prince Bishopric of Liège, a principality of the Holy Royal Roman Empire, benefited enormously from the influences of both France and Germany. And again, while in London, Sprimont surrounded himself with Huguenot craftsmen who also had links to Europe. The exaggerated style of his handles and finials on many of the Chelsea vases, if not copying gilt metal mounted examples, may have been based on print sources, similar to the almost impossible to execute modern designs for furniture published in 1755 by the London carver Thomas Johnson. In 1761, Johnson published 150 new designs and dedicated the frontispiece of this set of prints for furniture designs with its hidden references to the Anti-Gallican Association, seen here on the left. Sprimont was aware of the patriotic Anti-Gallican Society founded in 1745, which aimed to improve Britain's economic competitiveness through enhanced design skills with the ultimate goal of eliminating the preference for imported French luxuries. He even produced a snuff box in the form of a British lion devouring a French cockerel, as here from the British Museum. The Anti-Gallican coat of arms appears not only on the Battersea enamel plaque in the center, but also on the frontispiece of the book. And you can see it just below the flying puto. Britannia, seated at the top of the cartouche, looks down at the scowling, jealous French carpenter holding a flag with the fleur-de-lis, while at the top, the flying puto sets fire to a banner inscribed French papier-mâché, clearly competition for the cabinet makers of London. This satirical print, published in 1757, a year into the 7 Years' War, depicts the crowded Custom House quay in London, where a ship recently arrived from France is seen unloading French immigrants and other imports. Despite the war, the British continued to feed their appetite for all things French to the detriment of British manufacturers. Smuggling was a fact of life. In 1755, the carver, Johnson, issued a set of 12 designs for girandoles or wall lights for candles, almost none of which are executable, pure flights of fancy, allowing the designer's creativity to explore various concepts and themes. Fremont's gold anchor vases, when seen en masse here, are not so dissimilar to Johnson's paper variations on a theme, which are not isolated examples. In an article by Anne Pwitz, Drawing from Fancy, concerning British design prints in the mid-18th century, the author explains how designers such as the carver Thomas Johnson and others capitalized on the concept of infinite variety. The ability to come up with ever new designs was crucial to compete with foreign imports and was the prerequisite of internationally competitive craftsmen refusing to slavishly copy the inventions of others. Chelsea's infinite variety of gold anchor vases, the majority probably introduced between 1759 and 1763, advertised Fremont's powers of invention and skills as a draftsman, albeit in clay rather than prints or drawings. But whether their variety amounted to virtuosity is debatable. It didn't lead to commercial success as the manufactory failed, primarily, however, because of health. It is possible that these gold anchor period vases were his attempt in the spirit to adapt the French Rococo to suit English taste. While not a vase, perhaps the most important dated commission for Chelsea, and among the last, was the equally flamboyant Mecklenburg Strelitz service made by Chelsea to a royal commission for Queen Charlotte's brother, ordered in 1763 and delivered by 1764. The details of the decoration can help to date that on some of the vases, note in particular the painted garlands, and also the use of raised molding to contain the cobalt blue on all the objects. A costly enterprise. In 1763, Horace Walpole commented on it. I cannot boast of our taste. The forms are neither new, beautiful, nor various. Yet Fremont, the manufacturer, is a Frenchman. It seems their taste will not bear transplanting. Over a decade later, Thomas Bentley, Josiah Wedge's advisor on taste, made equally disparaging remarks on their visit to Sèvres. They have an immense number of ornamental vases, and among several hundred, there may be about a half a dozen very elegant forms. The rest are barbarous beyond conception. I wonder what Bentley thought of Chelsea's gold anchor vases. I now want to turn to the subject of decoration, which of course could probably fill a whole talk. So I'm just going to sort of focus on one particular style, the Dutch peasants, after the painter David Teniers. But I just want to kind of remind you of what a difference that the ground colors and painted decoration, and even the use of gilding or not, kind of transforms the shape and has a completely different interpretation based on the decoration. This pair of vases, among the most extreme of the Rococo production, represents two different tastes. The vase on the left from the V&A collection, with its Mazarin blue ground, has a romantic pastoral scene after painting by François Boucher, Les Délices de l'Automne, one of a set made from Madame de Pompadour and engraved by Jean Dolet sometime between 1755 and 1763. The decoration evokes the products of the Vincennes and later Sèvres factory, while the other, in the British Museum's collection, with its pastel, claret and green details and white ground, references more the mid-18th century wares of the Meissen or Dresden factory, as it was then known. The painted subject matter of a Dutch conversation piece with peasants is a direct copy of Les Fumeurs Hollandois, after David Teniers, who died in 1690, so quite a dated print. The print was by the French engraver based in London, quite a dated scene, not the print. The print was by the French engraver based in London, Pierre-Charles Canot, and published on 30th September 1757, which helped dating sense of the date for the vase. The depictions of these peasant scenes on high-end luxury wares may seem odd, but not unique. In 1747, again, Horace Walpole described Dutch painters as drudging mimics of nature's most uncomely coarseness. Yet Teniers' work had become fashionable in Paris and London among connoisseurs. Such scenes appear on Meissen as well as Sèvres porcelain. The vase is even more interesting as it was formerly in the collection of Queen Charlotte, wife of George III. It was included in her sale held by Christie's on 11th of May, 1819. A very large pear-shaped vase of old Chelsea with scalloped arabesque ornaments and pierced necks. The front painted with a group of smokers, birds, and landscapes on the reverse. In fact, it may have been among a collection of ornamental china of the Chelsea manufacture, which is painted in the most exquisite taste, purchased by Her Majesty on 19th of February, 1763, again on the eve of the 7 Years' War. Dame Rosalind Saville discussed the rustic Teniers-type scenes that appear on Sèvres porcelain as early as 1758, which became more common from 1759 and well into the mid-1760s. And they were also copied from similar identifiable print sources. So while not an obvious Rococo subject matter, these Flemish genre scenes offered an idealized version of rural life and its freedoms, close to nature. The Teniers themes appears on a pair of gold anchor vases formerly in the collection of the Duke of Newcastle, sold in 1921. A few years later, in 1937, the Duke sold another Chelsea vase with a rare turquoise ground, now in the British Museum here in the upper right. So clearly, it would appear that he was a connoisseur of the Chelsea factory. A pair of vases match a description in the 1761 auction sale, where they were listed as two separate lots. Lot 70, one magnificent perfume vase and cover of the fine Mazarin blue gold, picturesque ornament, which I think refers to the scrolled arms, curiously enameled with figures after 10 years. Lot 70, ditto of the same beauty and magnificence. There are 8 different scenes of Dutch peasants in the style of Teniers painted on the vases, but they appear to be inventions, and similar vignettes can be found in other items by the factory, but painted by a variety of hands. Here, however, it may be the work of one of the Duviviers working for Sprimont, but I don't know if Michelle Beanie or Nick have found the print sources, but I had a quick look but couldn't find anything. Two other examples of Teniers themes appear on 2 rather unsuccessful shapes. Apologies. The vases on the left at Burley House at Lincolnshire probably date from around 1762, are perhaps those listed in an inventory of 1763 as 2 large Chelsea china jars paneled with white. The vases have the same raised rim around the painted panel to prevent the flow of the cobalt blue as seen on the Foundling, Chesterfield, and British Museum vases of 62-63. John Mallet has identified the painter as Jeffries Hammett O'Neill. The popularity of the Dutch scenes may also relate to a theatrical performance, a new afterpiece entitled The Flemish Feast, said to be taken from the pictures of Teniers, which was performed at the Drury Lane Theatre in 1759. It was a short opera or pantomime with comical dances with rustic and domestic subjects performed at the end of a very heavy dramatic production and continued to be produced until 1763. The title of the piece matches that of the Fête Flamande, seen here on the right, engraved in 1751 by Lebas after Teniers, which is a painting also associated with Madame de Pompadour. A final example of peasant scenes is found on a pair of vases at the Tully House Museum in Carlisle, probably dating from around 1762, and Mallet has also attributed the painting to Jeffries Hammett O'Neill. For comparison, and to illustrate the popularity of the theme, on the left is a Worcester jar, one of a pair circa 1768 to 1770, also decorated with Flemish scenes. The painting is characteristic of the work of an artist who signed his work with the monogram J.D., frequently identified as the Scottish miniature painter John Donaldson, who arrived in London in 1760 and worked at Chelsea and later for Worcester, whose work we have seen earlier on the Worcester garniture, and he may have been decorator of many of these Chelsea vases from the Gold Anchor period. One of the most confusing aspects of Chelsea gold anchor vases is that some of Fremont's undecorated stock was sold to William Dewsbury of Derby in 1770 along with their molds. This meant that these Rococo forms, though no longer fashionable, could be decorated in a new classical manner. The single vase at Tatton Park, Cheshire, in the National Trust collection is such an example. The shape was probably created around 1762, but the classical decoration is from an engraved plate in the 4th volume of Les Métamorphoses d'Ovide, published in Paris in 1771. The 1st volume was published in 1767. Each of these stories from classical mythology, translated by Abbé Bagné, had engraved plates after famous paintings, and many of the scenes painted on the vases are accurately described in Dewsbury's April 1771 auction sale. A month earlier, the 4 volumes were advertised for sale by T. Davies in Russell Street, Covent Garden, but of course individual volumes had been sold in London earlier. South, incidentally, only began to use these prints as a design source a decade later, around 1781. Another example of the same thing is in the V&A, but for time I won't dwell on it. But I will look at this vase. This popular shape was introduced around 1761 to 63 and is more frequently found with these swirling garlands, a copy of a Vincennes design that appeared on tea rares around 1753 to 56. Again, an example of the French prototype, which was acquired in 1755 in Paris by Lord Bolingbroke and evidently made available to Fremont. There's a pair of these vases with this pattern at Audley End in Essex. And just to say, the painted garlands are very similar to the painted garlands on the Mechlin service, although in a different format. Dewsbury continued to delve into his archive of Chelsea models and molds while operating the Chelsea workshop in London. At the V&A here on the left is one of a pair of extremely large square or octagonal vases with shoulders encrusted with naturalistic flowers and foliage. One side is painted with classical subjects of a Bacchante drinking from a chalice, and then the other innocents washing at an altar. The pair are described in the 1781 auction catalogue of the previous year's stock. The shape, admittedly about the least Rococo of the group, was in production in the gold anchor period over 2 decades earlier, as seen in the center vase at the Walters Art Gallery in Baltimore. The octagonal shape was revived or recreated at the Minton China Manufactory around 1826 to 1840, as seen in this drawing from their shape book of that date. It was surprisingly chosen to evoke the Rococo style associated with Old Chelsea. However, the Minton factory has added even more elaborate twisted handles to the rigid form, as if it wasn't Rococo enough, confirming the style's revival and continued appreciation. There is still much research needed on this group of gold anchor vases, even if you agree the design's not always the best of taste. Evidence of the absence of academically trained draftsmen in England. However, as you can see, they make the best of it, creating a huge variety of shapes and decorative designs, hoping to appeal to a discriminating luxury market, and as I've tried to point out, made over a relatively short period of time. It's a fascinating subject, at least to me, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Patricia. That talk was wonderful. I really, really enjoyed going back to the Rococo and really had my Rococo fill there. There was so much elaborate decoration all crammed into the one. I know that a lot of people are, on the fence about the gold anchor vases. But I must say I'm a fan. But then again, I am a fan of 19th century neo-Rococo, so I think you can kind of see where I'm coming from there. but I think even the Rococo, even the Chelsea vases, I think compared to some of the 19th century revival pieces, I think even Chelsea just go a bit too far on some of the pieces for the decoration.
Yes, a little editing would have gone a long way, I think. But
yeah.
anyway.
Yes, tone it down a little bit, but no, they're wonderful. Thank you so much, Patricia. To all of our listeners, please do pop some questions in the Q&A. We do have 5 minutes to answer any questions. While we're waiting for those to come through, I'll just tell you a little bit about our next winter talk. which is on the 21st of January, and it will be by Ivan Day on Frozen Delights, A History of Porcelain and Ice Cream. It's going to be a very interesting talk. Ivan was visited the museum last week to have a closer look at our ice pails in the collection. So it's going to be really, really fun. I'm really looking forward to it. Also have a quick look on our website for our final talk, which is in March, which is a double act with Dr. Neil Buttery and Paul Crane on sugar, slavery and empire, and the evolution of Worcester porcelain sucrières. So do join us for that one as well. So let's have a little look at our Q&A. So Richard White asks, since Chelsea used a variety of cast moulds to create these unrestrained porcelain handles, do these presumably plaster moulds still exist?
I don't think very much survives from the factory, if any. I mean, I think there's maybe some shards that were found on site in Chelsea, but I don't, yeah, like nothing, I don't think. I mean, not identified.
No, it's very sad, isn't it? I know we're lucky to have some mould here, but there's not much that survives of Chelsea. So, any more questions coming through? I'll just ask while we're possibly waiting for some more to come through. Patricia, could you just kind of enlighten us a little bit about who may have been purchasing these wonderful vases? And we know that they would have put them on as a garniture, but where else might they have placed them in the home?
Well, that's a good question. And it's something I'm quite interested in, provenance, obviously. And it's remarkable just how many actually do have an aristocratic provenance. I mean, you know, you can't always say if it's sold by someone in the 20th century, you know, who's to say they weren't collecting in the 19th century? So unless you can really find it's in an inventory from the 18th century, and even then, you know, the descriptions are so vague, it's sometimes hard to be secure. But in terms of how they displayed them, again, there's very few depictions of porcelain from the 18th century in situ, I think. So I'd like to think some of them went into that china case the Chippendale made, but or sat on top of some nice Chippendale pieces. In some cases, the designs might have reflected each other, the great scrolls and things. But yeah, there isn't a great deal, I think, of really documentary sources that can really tell us, you know, what piece was actually displayed where. So, you know, it's hard to say.
Thank you. Yes, and thank you for I know this isn't a talk on Worcester porcelain, but it's definitely looking at the comparison with Chelsea. I think it really helps us try to understand other English manufacturers as well, and kind of put Worcester into context. And it's definitely helped me, because I would definitely love to introduce a little bit more Rococo interpretation into the museum. So thank you for starting that off for us. So we've got no questions coming through today. So thank you very much, Patricia, for speaking for us this evening. It's been wonderful. Kate, I'll hand over to you.
Oh yes, just to say thank you so much, everyone, for supporting us. Thank you very much to Patricia for supporting us as well and delivering the talk. It was fascinating. I don't often get a chance to really absorb the history, so it's a real treat for me to be able to sit down and have this time to listen. So I appreciate everyone attending. Do attend the next winter talk. We look forward to seeing you again soon. And we'll close now. I think that's it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.